On this exciting event, asking a vital question. How can technology help us to bring more equality and inclusivity? Norway is a wealthy country, but do you know what has been the most valuable investment for Norway? What is the thing that has generated most growth in Norway? Do you know that? It's not salmon. It's not black metal. It's not gas and oil, but I have some Norwegian women here, they know. The answer to Norwegian's wealth starts with women. That women entered the labor market and our economy boomed. Women was the game changer for Norwegian economy. Today, Norway is one of the most gender equal countries in the world. We have a long and proud tradition for making achieve efforts, for making targeted efforts, and for making systematic efforts for promoting gender equality in all sectors of our society. Therefore, it's obvious that we are in our age to set gender equality in relation to technology in the agenda as well. We need to highlight how technology can be used as a democratic force, how it can empower people and decrease socio-economic gaps. Not let us just accept the difficulties, but manage the development and take control over the technology. And that is why I'm so happy to be here today. The United States is a leading country in developing of artificial intelligence and technology. And the US also have a way of interesting discussion of the ethics and the personals of IA and automation. In the discussion for the forthcoming challenges, it's useful to exchange perspective of how we should move forward. Technology is its core both liberalization and democratization. We have all the knowledge in the world available in our pocket, just a few touches away. That's actually empowerment of people. We started as tech optimists, but in the last years we have become more skeptical, with a good reason. But still I am a tech optimist, because in the end we are the one making the algorithm. We are the one that are in control of the technology. As politicians, we need more active on this debate. The rapid development of technology and IA promises to provide solutions to many of the challenges we face in the years to come. However, white men still dominate the tech world. This is two challenges. We need a tech world for the many. If we are to create solutions that will bring us forward, we cannot afford to leave the women behind. If we have to make use of the potential of IA and technology, we cannot recruit talent from only half of the population. That is only stating the obvious, but technology and artificial intelligence is only as good as the engineers designs the system. Diversity among developers and designers are vital to avoid reproducing stereotypes and gender bias. We need technological solutions that works for the entire population in all its variety and diversity, not only for men. As many here know, Amazon accepted to design an algorithm-based tool to make their recruiting process more effective. The algorithm turned out to favor men. As I said, technology and artificial intelligence is only as good as the engineer designed the system. This is why we need diversity, also in the tech world. This is why we need to utilize the democratic empowerment force in the technology. In Norway, we invest in and encourage more gender-balanced tech world. Still, boys and girls choose different education and different occupations. In 2018, less than 30% of the applicants to STEM programs in higher education were women. Less than 3 out of 10. That is not good enough. So, what can we do? I think we need to start with the fundamental. In order to get more women involved in technology, we need to make sure that young people choose the education they want, regardless of article ideas about what suit boys and what suit girls. This issue is high on the political agenda in Norway. The government has appointed a committee called Ung I dag, or Young Today. This committee will propose measures of how we can encourage young people to make non-traditional education and occupation choices. We also believe that female role models are important. We need to change the perspective that technology cares only about boys. This is why the government support and protect called Girls in Technology. This organizes annual conferences and expertise days for girls in secondary schools and upper secondary schools. This project aims to inspire girls to showcasing female role model in the tech world. Because we need all the idols, we need all the role models. We need to see that it's not an unfortunate dream, but it's a true opportunity. And that goes for equality in general. Equality in the tech world can reduce social inequality and provide possibilities. Technology and AI is changing the nature of how we live and work. It's a positive force if we use it right. It can provide us with solutions for the future, but only if we avoid reproductive existing biases and secure privacy, transparency, and accountability. Only if we make sure that AI is developed as inclusive and as possible and for the benefits of the whole population. Today, we are setting these questions on the agenda. I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion and to learn about how we can overcome these challenges. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Minister Skei Grande. So we're just going to do a little bit of magic here, put the last chair on. So let me quickly introduce our panel and turn it over to them. So we have Megan Garcia will be our moderator. She is our colleague and a senior fellow at New America. We are delighted. She's based in Phoenix. We're so delighted that she's here. She's an expert in AI and ethics. We also have Alexandra Metescu. She is with Data and Society. She is a researcher on labor and tech issues. And Data and Society is a nonprofit research organization based here in New York, focused on the social and cultural indicators of data implications, I couldn't read my handwriting, implications of data-centric technology. We also have Bente Kalsnes. She's an associate professor at Oslo Metropolitan University, a former journalist and an expert on digital media. And finally, we have Bruce Lincoln, co-founder of Silicon Harlem, a for-profit social venture dedicated to transforming Harlem into a hub for technology and innovation. So, everyone, let's please welcome the panel.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm Megan Garcia, our moderator for tonight. You got brief introductions of our great panelists. I just wanted to start off by echoing something that the minister said, and I'm sure that you're all feeling. we're in this really interesting moment where we, as multiple societies, now speaking about the United States and Norway and other countries, are starting to think more deeply about our relationship with technology. So can you guys, panelists included, so shout out your most favorite dystopian technology movie. Terminator, who has one? Anyone? Oh, iRobot. Come on. What was that? Black Mirror. Electric Dreams. Keep them coming. What was that? Ex Machina, I think. Did you have one?
Terminator would be mine.
Terminator. We got 1, 2, 3. Come on. Anybody else? So it's interesting that our societal discussions are catching up to our creative impulses. And so really broadly, that's one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. More specifically, on the heels of International Women's Day, we're going to be talking about two sides of a coin. One is how do we get more women into tech, and sort of what is the state of women in tech? And relatedly, as jobs change because of automation, what does that mean for women in the workforce? So really broadly, we're going to be talking about those two topics. And I'm thinking we're probably also lightly going to touch on some easy other topics like privacy and the self. We'll try and keep it together up here. So with that, let's just dive in. So Bente, I'm really interested in the Norwegian perspective, and I'm sure many of the Americans in our audience are as well. What is Norway doing to bring more women into tech? Are there things that Norway is doing that the United States is not doing?
I guess we're struggling with the same issues as you're doing, but as Trine Skei Grande mentioned, to start early, that's important. And for 6 years, I was organizing something called the Girl Geek Dinners. So that was a meeting space for women interested in technology. So a informal gathering where we had different topics all the time. And something that was important for us was to create a networking space, but also to encourage role models, and also untraditional role models. And we've seen lots of that kind of organization popping up for the last 10 years, and it's becoming very important meeting spaces, and also it's becoming companies. And another thing I would like to mention is an initiative called Learn Kids to Code. So in order to start early, it's not enough to start in the universities. We need to start much earlier than that. So I think that's been a very important initiative in order to encourage both boys and girls to be interested in technology. But in general, I think the whole role model question has been important also when it comes to recruiting young girls to higher education. And that's also been sponsored by the governments, and the schools have been very active in doing that. So that's some of the initiatives we've seen.
Would you say in Norway that most of those initiatives are led by the government, by employers or companies, by educational institutions, or is it a gathering of all of those?
It's a mix, yeah. So it's a mix of different kind of funding, different kind of initiatives. Some of the initiatives are on a voluntary basis, others are sponsored by big tech companies, but I think a mixture is a good way to do that.
Great. And Bruce, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you think about equality and technology? I know you have we were talking earlier about kind of your framework for thinking about it.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we founded Silicon Harlem specifically to address the issue that as what we see is technology becoming the second largest industrial sector growing in the city of New York, how historically there was an issue when it came to access to people of color and women, especially from underserved communities such as Harlem or the South Bronx or Brooklyn or Jamaica, Queens. And so we wanted to address that issue, and we wanted to do it specifically in Harlem because there was a unique set of circumstances there. One, with a university such as Columbia there and City College, ultimately it was very clear to us that companies would ultimately have to start to get spun out of that university and get spun into Harlem. So my partner and I, Clayton Banks, as well as another colleague, Carlton Brown, we worked very closely on building, it wasn't the first co-working space, but it was the first entertainment center that also had high-speed internet. It actually had the first FiOS drop, so we could support that kind of activity. And so on February 26th, we had our first meetup, modeled after what they did in Digital Dumbo. So we thought maybe there'll be like 30, 40 geeks like us, right? It'll be really cool. 500 people showed up. And so we were right time, right place, and from that meetup, we've now built a for-profit social venture that addresses everything from making sure the elected officials are enlightened as to the policies that they should support, to the local community being involved and galvanized around the importance of technology, to programs in schools. And where we're now very focused is making sure that the internet as deployed doesn't leave behind underserved communities. So we're making sure that Harlem will be at the forefront of 5G rather than a laggard. So it's this multifaceted set of strategies that we're working towards. And what we hope ultimately is that we'll then start to attract the kind of venture capital which then can create the kind of liftoff that is quite so often missing in these types of ventures.
That's great. And do you see people responding to the idea that there should be equality in access to technology? Is it that people are responding to the idea that there should be equality in access to technology jobs? What is it that people are responding to most that you see?
Well, one of the things about Silicon Harlem, which is really cool, is one, we're consciously diverse. You know, we're multicultural, we're multi-genderal, but we're also a part of a movement that's unique in America because of so many different people in New York who are coming at this from the civic tech aspect of these things. And so people feel that it's important to get into tech, so we have families now forming after-school robotics programs for their kids. We have Black Girls Code, which is now supported at Google. So we see this in a lot of different areas, but it's still sort of scratching the surface. We still haven't achieved, though there's great growth, we haven't achieved, as I was saying, that sort of critical mass where it really takes off.
And Alexandra, you work with gig workers women who are gig workers, right? Am I getting this right? Okay. Can you explain a little bit more about what your research is and how you think about gender in tech?
Sure. So I'm a researcher and ethnographer, not a technologist. So I've spent the last year and a half looking at domestic workers and labor platforms. Essentially, labor platforms are increasingly brokering domestic work. Domestic work has historically been part of the informal economy, but as these labor platforms are increasingly mediating this work, it's creating a lot of sort of tensions and complications in the ways that domestic workers are experiencing work. Part of what sort of motivated my work was that, which is co-authored with my colleagues Julia Ticona and Alex Rosenblatt, is that a lot of the discourses around the gig economy tend to focus around Uber and Lyft because they have sort of the greatest visibility among gig economy platforms. And when women are thought of in the gig economy, it tends to be sort of, entrepreneurs on Etsy or women doing sort of white-collar freelance work on a lot of these platforms. But there's very little discussion of care and cleaning work, particularly because domestic work is one of the most growing forms of service work in the U.S. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics predicts that there's going to be over 1 million home health aide jobs, for example, that are going to be created in the U.S. But one of the downsides of this is that this is low-wage work. It's very precarious. There's a lot of risks of sexual harassment and other issues involved. And the average annual salary of a home health aide is between $19,000 and $24,000 a year. And domestic workers working on gig platforms sort of face a lot of the conditions that, it's not that the gig economy created these conditions, but that in a lot of ways, some of the sort of platform policies often exacerbate a lot of historical issues.
And we've talked about how for women in particular who are using gig platforms, that there's kind of subtleties in the way that technology can be a good thing and a bad thing. What are you hearing from them about how technology is positive and negative for them?
Sure. So first thing off the bat is we found that there was a huge array of motivations for why women worked on gig platforms. They might have, strong professional identity as a nanny or a house cleaner, or they might have be experiencing precarity in other industries, and they're using this to sort of supplement their income, or they were laid off at their jobs and they're ending up doing, work on these gig platforms. But sort of all in all, what we sort of saw is that it's precarious work. It's sort of often a short-term solution for a lot of these workers, and they often make pretty hard trade-offs in their work. And a lot of the features sort of create pressures on workers. So one example is the rating systems on these platforms. So basically, if you get too many low ratings on the platform, you get deactivated, which means you get booted off. So this creates a lot of pressure on workers to stay at a job, even if, for example, their client is sexually harassing them or is pressuring them to do something, unsafe while they're working. So it sort of creates this situation where, like, on the one hand, it's sort of still better than if you are, finding cleaning jobs on Craigslist or through word of mouth, because there is this company that you can sort of appeal to. But at the same time, it's a very weak sort of accountability, because there's sort of a faceless customer service rep that you can reach to, go to if you have a problem. But it's often not enough for a lot of the women that I spoke to.
And are you seeing any solutions either being proposed or enacted, either by the companies, by the women who you talk with in your research, by others? Or are we still sort of at the what do we do stage when it comes to your work?
I think a great example of this is the work that the National Domestic Workers Alliance has been doing. So they're basically a national network of domestic worker organizations. And one of the things that they've done is they've created this mobile platform called Aliyah that basically domestic workers can sign up for and employers can sign up for and pay into it. And they can accrue paid sick days and overtime pay, and they can access health insurance options. And then in addition to that, there are also several domestic worker cooperatives that have sort of leveraged their own domestic worker apps. The one that comes to mind is Up and Go here in New York City. And sort of the benefits of this is that domestic workers themselves have contributed to the design of these platforms, and they also share in the profits of it, which is really important because a lot of these tech platforms take a pretty sizable commission off of the work that domestic workers do, and they also provide training and support for them, which a lot of these tech platforms don't do because they're independent contractors and they rarely actually see a human manager. It's usually the app is kind of your manager.
That's really interesting. And relates to something that I have been thinking about and working on, which is how automation impacts jobs, or how we think it's going to impact jobs. And some of the research we've done at New America has shown that in many regions around the United States, at least, and I can't speak to Norway on this one, that about a third of jobs are likely to be automated over the next several years. And what that means is, some of them will go away, some of them will change very dramatically, but the work will either be gone or the person doing the work is going to have to adapt. And that in particular, the sectors that are most likely to be impacted are retail sales, so like people working at stores, food service, people in restaurants, and the back office functions that we often don't think about in day-to-day life. And it turns out that many of the people in those jobs are women. So at least in the United States, we have this idea that the people who are going to be impacted by automation are wearing hard hats and on the factory floor, when in fact, that's not the case. It's usually low-skilled, younger women. So in thinking about that, one of the beauties of this panel is that we all work on different aspects of this issue, but it also makes this conversation hopefully particularly rich. So in thinking about how women's jobs are likely to be impacted by automation, do you all have thoughts? I work with cities around the country to try and get them ready for this reality. They're just starting to try and implement some solutions. Has anyone in your work either seen employers grappling with this, so thinking about companies of all kinds grappling with this, or seen workers grappling with this yet? Or is this still so new that it hasn't surfaced?
I mean, there's been so many different kind of reports on what kind of jobs are going to be most hit by automation. In Norway, we've been seeing reports that this is going to hit, like you said, service industries, education, healthcare, lawyers, finance, accountants, drivers, the whole range of jobs. And also from my background, journalists, because we know that there's robots producing more of the journalism. So it seems to be not just one sector, but everything. But I think we don't have a clear picture of that yet.
And just to clarify, so one of the ways that we think about what's automatable is to think about each job broken down into tasks and which tasks are easily replicatable by a computer. So like if you think about, or maybe you've been to like a Panera or McDonald's or whatever recently, you can order on a screen. Increasingly, it's easy for those of us who go to restaurants to order on a screen and even sometimes be served automatically, as well as thinking about back office functions, some accounting jobs and legal jobs, and lots of repetitive kind of office work. So if you're wondering what is automated and how do we figure it out, it's trying to think about what is easily replicatable by a computer.
I should add to that in a lot of cases, it's not simply a story of robots replacing jobs. It's also about how workers are being displaced or end up sort of working with technology. So for example, the example of self-service kiosks, in the 90s, there was a prediction that self-checkout was going to replace all cashier jobs in the US. And that just did not come to pass. The number of cashiers in the US has either stayed stable, grown, or like decreased slightly. But that didn't quite come to pass. But it did shift a lot of the roles of workers, often in ways that kind of casualized work, or created more part-time positions and sort of de-skilled in some ways.
It's interesting because a lot of our projections have to do with thinking about current low-skilled jobs that may either change dramatically or go away. So if you think about like the grocery store experience, for those of us who still occasionally go to a grocery store and don't, get them all delivered, that many of those sort of checkout roles may go away, but there may be a concierge type person who sees you in the aisle and says, hey, I'm actually trained in nutrition, or I'm trained as a chef. How can I help you buy what you need for dinner? And that's a totally different set of skills than the person who is repeatedly scanning something. So thinking about the migration toward higher skilled jobs that then require more education, more training, and where are folks going to get that? That's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. And so I skipped over you, Bruce. Did you want to answer my initial question?
Yeah, I think, once again, it's a multifaceted way we need to look at this, because there's a lot of issues that are happening here. We already see the loss of jobs as it has to do with basically driverless trucks. It may have a driver in that truck, but that driver is basically being viewed by a video camera, and they have to meet certain kind of algorithmic keys in order to get paid. And they had something recently on HBO that looked at the robotization of jobs. So that was one area that they looked at. And this gentleman was someone from the heartland of the United States of America, someone who'd worked in this job for a long time and supported his family, and now he's in a truck that is very much really driverless. And he's having real issues. And it's not simply the economic issues. There's a sense of self issue. There's psychological issues in terms of how this is negatively affecting people. And one of the things that I have a problem with is this idea that they've projected the jobless future as something that is inevitable and a fait accompli, that we have to accept that jobs are just going to basically go out of existence. And I think we need to really address that truly from an ethical standpoint and from a standpoint of thinking about equity, because this is not the same as when jobs were replaced as far as you worked on a farm and then they had to move you into the factory. This is an order of magnitude change where we're not necessarily going to see these jobs come back, and there's these sociological ramifications to all of these changes. So I think altogether we really have to get a handle on it and come up with some very real policies where we can address some of these things. Not necessarily saying we can sort of stem the tide of these technologies, but I think we have to basically inject this with a sense of humanism and humanitarianism that heretofore has been brought to bear against some of these issues.
Bruce, have you seen anyone articulate any policy or other solutions that seem like a good fit?
I think we're just starting to have those conversations. I don't think we've had it on the scale where you need to really address this. And I think one of the things that has happened is you've got the great work that people are doing at Data and Society, but it hasn't been brought to bear to where a whole lot of people altogether are sort of framing this. So it isn't the same thing that captured our attention when, in essence, what you saw in northern Great Britain was that of the Luddites, who really shunned going into factories because of what it did. But I think maybe this is the basis for how we start to really frame that conversation, platform it in history, but really have an important way to look at it so that what we, in essence, do is, you know, what some of the early Silicon Valley folks did was talk about invent the future. Let's take over ownership of the future and invent it in such a way that it's equitable.
So it's interesting. This is one of those classic, at least American problems, where there's no real owner of the problem, and so we don't have an owner of the solution. So unpacking a little bit of what Bruce just said. So we have found, at least, that employers, for the most part, are not standing up and waving their hands and saying, we want to fix it, we want to fix it. They don't quite know what to do. City leaders, who I work with quite a bit, are just barely gaining awareness that this is a problem and is going to really impact their regional economies in the next 5 to 10 years. And they're not sure what to do either. And then workers are definitely not sure, especially those who are most likely to be impacted, who, again, tend to be lower skilled workers. And so one of the things that I try and do is try and figure out ways that we can pilot some solutions, so at least we have something to go on, because I agree, we're still sort of all grappling. So one idea is, and I would love everyone's thought on this, one idea is to move away from the sense that we all need, or at least the kind of higher skilled people of the United States and elsewhere, need a 4-year college degree in order to compete, and often graduate degrees, that instead we move to the idea of lifelong learning. So the expectation that we're all going to be learning the whole way through. All of our jobs are very likely to change, and so we should just plan from childhood on that we're going to sort of be learning on a continuum forever. And we've started to see some large public universities adopt this perspective. So Arizona State University, close to where I am from, is piloting lots of ways to think about lifelong learning. They target adult learners, they have a high school, they're sort of thinking through all the stages of learning. But that's a really different model than what we currently have in the United States. So, and also, we haven't figured out who's going to pay for it. So, for example, if we have lots and lots of retail workers who suddenly need very different skills, you can think about my grocery concierge example. How does that happen? We haven't figured that out yet. So, wondering if you all have thoughts about the potential switch in thinking about learning in the United States and Norway.
Yeah, I think that's crucial in this question, because we know that change is happening and is happening fairly fast, and we need to learn new skills. And I think that is something Norway's or the Norwegian workforce is fairly good at. And there's also fairly good systems in order to, if you get fired or if you lose your job, there's a system to help you get some new competences, to get some different kind of education. So I think that is helping change the development when they see one part of the economy is doing bad. And people need to move to a different part of the country, and they also have to achieve new skills in order to be able to be part of the workforce again. So I think the whole debate about automatization is enforcing the need for reskilling, re-education, continuing education. It's not something you only do when you're young, it's something you do continually.
I think something at the same time to also be careful of is how this could also, the access is incredibly important when it comes to this, because if it creates a sort of labor stratification, using the example back to retail, where a lot of proposed changes to sort of salespeople is that to sort of focus on creating more sort of experience-oriented work of retail salespeople rather than cashiers, but that also could potentially create a kind of stratification where if the sales retail jobs that are left are held by white college-educated women from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, and that hasn't quite solved the problem. I see this a lot in domestic work, where there's a long sociological literature about how race plays a role in what kinds of wages and jobs that domestic workers can command. So there are usually sort of white professionalized nannies who hold master's degrees in early childhood educations, and they can command, pretty high wages as care workers. And then there are immigrant women, often women of color, who often can afford these sorts of credentials, but they might have 10 years of experience working in child or elder care, but they can't command the same wages. So with discussions of skilling and preparing people for work, there needs to be discussion of who gets left behind as a result of these new sort of steps and institutions that arrives in place in order to facilitate that.
Absolutely, and I think the one way that I see that discussion crystallize is when people fight about boot camps. So not like the buff boot camps, but coding boot camps. So that's one point of contention about whether our collective goal as a society should be to allow people who have access to relatively expensive programs to gain coding skills, or whether the focus should be on those who don't have the resources to access something like a coding boot camp, or both, or all of the above, and add in new things. So I definitely see that discussion starting to bubble up around the country. One way that I have seen companies try and get at this is to focus on upskilling, so adding additional skills to their current workforce. So some forward-thinking retail companies are starting to say, hey, we see that in the next 5 years, we're gonna have a dramatic change in what our jobs look like, and probably many of the people who are currently doing the lowest skilled jobs are either going to have those jobs go away or change dramatically. Let's get them ready. And so that's one way that we can get at the skills gap and the race gap in this, but that thus far has been a very rare set of solutions that I've actually seen deployed out there in the world. Did you want to speak to lifelong learning or any aspect of learning?
I'll give you an example of an area where that's happening. And what's interesting is now lifelong learning is something we've been talking about for quite some time now, as it has to do with this idea of how you would learn with digital technologies. But what they're talking about now is this idea of incessant and continuous learning. And there's one area where they're very focused on making sure that they're retaining those workers, and it's being done at a major management consulting company, and those are forensic accountants. They're making sure that rather than lose these people, they're basically finding ways that AI can support them to do other targeted skills. And what the whole idea is I've spent a lot of money to get you to this point in my company. It's basically less expensive for me to retain you than to figure out how to replace you. So in a very innovative way, they're looking at how AI actually works with these workers, and they're training them internally. I've also had discussions with Oracle and a company called WorkFusion. Oracle is interested in AI. AI is creating certain types of jobs, especially for those who can be trained to do pattern recognition. And WorkFusion is looking at jobs where things are automated, but there's a job area where you could work with these automated technologies. And they see that as something that could be done as far as in 6 months, train these individuals, and they don't have to then go to college or even into a very formal coding program such as like a General Assembly. So there are those jobs starting to be created which will pay a decent wage for those who are currently underserved and underemployed. And so we're just starting to look at how to build those kind of programs. But otherwise, The overall societal issue we're looking at is this idea of mass economic dislocation, the likes of which we've never viewed. So that's why we have to get a handle on it. And if you look at the report, I forget what the young man from Oxford, his name is, but he wrote a report that looks at all the jobs that will be automated out of existence, and it's not simply low-skilled jobs. There's some higher learning type jobs that will go out of existence as well, and sort of mid-skilled jobs might be those that still exist. So all of us have an impetus to want to get involved and solve this problem.
Yeah, and so just to add to your example, there's a lot of accounting jobs that could be automated, some legal jobs, things that do require more education, more skills, for sure. There's fewer numbers of them overall, but they're significant in certain parts of the country and other places. Did you want to say something, Bette?
Yeah, I just want to add that I've seen that this is kind of like a buzzword. It's almost a hype. So many people are talking about this, and sometimes it gets exaggerated. But also, we also see that lots of countries are developing strategies how to deal with this topic, and they're comparing with each other who's doing most, who's investing most. And that is also interesting to look into. How are they dealing with ethics, for example? Ethics of AI, when the machines are able to make decisions, how are we going to deal with that? Do we want human interference with those decisions, and how are we going to do that? So I look forward to we get a Norwegian strategy on the topic, because it's not on the table yet, but many of the European countries, the US has some kind of strategy. China has a strategy. They're very ambitious, putting so much money into this. So I think it's very important we think about all these ethical questions before the technology is able to develop too fast, too advanced.
And it's interesting you bring that up as, you know, the European member of the panel, because one of the things that has stymied that in the United States, stymied thinking in a deep way about ethics and AI, is that most algorithms created by any technology company here, are considered intellectual property. And so it's different than in a lot of EU states after the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, right? Yeah. In which there has to be some degree of transparency if someone feels as though they have been discriminated against by an algorithm. In the United States, we don't have that. So we have our technology companies saying, actually, you don't get to look and know how the algorithm made that decision, which is kind of crazy because they're the same company, right, operating transnationally. So what do you all think about that? Should we all be going towards where the EU is in terms of allowing people to understand whether and how they were discriminated against by AI? Or do you think that that's not a good idea? Bruce is already nodding. Do you want to speak first, Bruce?
No, I just think it makes sense. You know, I mean, some of what we're going to have to do as we're moving to the future is look back and see where we've done things in the past that made a lot of sense. So it's almost as if we need to look at the civil rights movement again, or the feminism movement again, and look at those things that we did, which really were driven by this idea that we want everyone to have, you know, parity when it comes to access to what each one of these leaps economically and socially mean, because what it tends to recapitulate, and we're seeing that now, are these same old issues of stratification or segregation or discrimination. And, you know, we've got to address this. So, I mean, I think it makes sense, you know, and everything can't just be these inviolate companies because they're these advanced technology companies, because increasingly they're affecting our lives in profound ways.
Go ahead.
When it comes to workplace issues, I think it's not just about questions of discrimination, but also just generally quality of work. So to give one example, automated scheduling software, which is incredibly widespread across low-wage work, particularly retail work. These are basically scheduling systems that use that crunch a lot of data about things like customer foot traffic, weather patterns, staffing, to basically make staffing decisions very rapidly in short term. So deciding like whether next week how many people you're going to actually need on staff on the floor, which is very economically profitable for retailers because they can cut labor costs. But one of the side effects is that it produces incredible scheduling instability for workers who basically don't know what their schedule is going to look like until 1 week, maybe 2 weeks in advance. And there's been research showing sort of the consequences of that for parents who have to, make childcare arrangements on the fly, can't really make plans, and a lot of other sort of economic instability side effects. And a lot of these systems basically are designed to create these kinds of avoidance hacks where they will schedule a worker, the system will know to schedule a worker up until the point before they're counted as full-time, and then they have to be given benefits. Or they'll make sure that nobody's working overtime, and they'll switch out another worker to do that shift. And there's been campaigns around this to create stable scheduling. So I think there's a lot of kind of wider ripple effects beyond just the question of discrimination that have to be sort of talked about when it comes to new technologies.
Yeah, and I think the question you mentioned, accountability, how to design for accountability, I think that's really challenging, because what we've seen when it comes to tech companies and their use of algorithm is that it's more or less what's called a black box. We don't know how the decisions are made. And it's business secrets, it's part of their commercial success, but at the same time this is really impacting people. And one of the examples that I would use earlier about Amazon and the recruitment process and how the AI made more male-friendly decisions is not only based on the programmers who has made the code, it's also based on the data itself. And what kind of data we have. If the data is based on male programmers and their kind of CVs and backgrounds, the system is going to prefer that kind of workers because they are the best according to that kind of definitions. So one of the challenges is also to take those issues into account in the design of the systems.
Yeah, I definitely think this is one of the ways that we're all kind of emerging from our naivete about technology and thinking, well, if we outsource our decisions to technology, they'll just automatically be less biased and better. And in fact, what we're finding is that even when we have good intentions, we ascribe our own biases into the technology we create. And so, we all have implicit biases, and so we end up embedding this stuff in technology. And I work a lot with people inside technology companies to try and get at the problem you're describing, which is how do we design ethics into the product design process? And, it's not like everybody in technology companies is out to get everybody else. But the way that the product design process has been crafted thus far, it really doesn't allow a place in most companies for ethics to be acknowledged or addressed in any way. So I think there is kind of some fundamental work to be done inside companies to allow the people designing and creating products to build ethics into and sort of checks into that process. All right, we're gonna move towards questions. Can I just ask each of you all, we've touched on a really wide range of topics here. Do you all want to offer one final comment on anything that we've talked about, whether that's, the International Women's Day and getting more women into tech, whether it's ethics and technology, whether it's thinking about AI and its role in society, lifelong learning? I mean, we've really run the gamut here. If anyone wants to offer a final comment, please do, and then we'll move to Q&A.
I'll share something. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean I happened to be at the Women in Technology event last Tuesday at Columbia University, and we had both Ursula Burns, an African-American woman who has risen to be the CEO of Xerox Corporation. Now she's heading up a company called Xenon, that is a 5G company. We also had Mary Boyce, who's the Dean of the School of Engineering at Columbia. And both of them touched on these issues from their standpoint. But one of the things that they both said was, you can't expect women to do well in an environment that's designed to be successful for men. And so what they said was, to get more women into technology and engineering, you needed to really, from the ground up, rebuild it, redesign it so that it really was womanocentric in the way in which it dealt with women's strengths, women's empathies, women's abilities, and then that will be truly the way in which what you'll have is the type of engineering profession that will see more women rise to the top. So I just wanted to share that with everyone. And sometimes you're going to have to build something new, reflective of how you see the world, if you want to actually be supportive of the way in which you see the world. And beyond this idea of implicit bias, there are worldview issues here which are very different if you look at how women look at the world and how men look at the world.
I think this is a crucial moment in time where it's possible to really make an impact in how we think about this technology at this point. As I mentioned, lots of countries are developing strategies for how to deal with this as a societal issue. And I also think it's very important that people with different kind of backgrounds, different gender, different ethical backgrounds take part of that discussion. And I also think it's very important that ethics and transparency and accountability is designed into these systems in order to try to avoid some of the problems we've seen with the Silicon Valley companies for the last 15 years. So, for example, what I've seen within the media field is, in order to try to avoid filter bubbles where you're reading more of what you've already read, it is possible to make some design solutions, not only to use the technology to make that kind of solution, but also have some more kind of editorial impact on the selection. So I think it's possible to learn from the near past as well.
So I think I will conclude by sort of pointing out that we shouldn't let fear of automation sort of foreclose different futures. I think the idea of jobs getting automated away is often used as a kind of bludgeon to prevent people from asking for more, particularly workers who, ask for better working conditions or better pay, and then they say, well, if you ask for more, then we'll replace you with robots. And it's also important to keep in mind that International Women's Day came out of labor activism and labor movement, so there's already sort of a connection between women, work, and rights that are sort of embedded in the spirit of this.
Great. Okay, so we have folks, I think, wandering around with mics. So if you have a question, feel free to just raise your hand and they will come find you. Don't everyone jump up at once. It's always the first person, then we're good.
Right. Thank you very much, guys, for coming out, first of all. So I wanted to ask, maybe particularly you, Alexandra, because I think this is more your expertise, but to any other of you, I would love to hear your opinions as well. There's a researcher at MIT, at Sloan, named Raghu Rajan, who basically, I think quite recently came with a study detailing how he predicts it's going to be more high-level or high-income jobs in the future, while also a lot more low-income jobs in the future, and then a substantial decrease in the middle-level pay that we've had a more a better supply of in the past. And I was wondering if you had any, policy recommendations to kind of ensure that low-income workers could live off of their salary, or have a sustainable living going forward. In that sense, that might be relevant to that discussion, or any other thoughts you might have on that.
So I should preface by saying I'm not an economist, so I'm not in the business of forecasting, so I can't really say whether or not that study will come to pass. As far as like I will say that I think it is correct that there are a lot of low wage jobs that are increasingly prevalent as a result of technology, not just the ways in which work might be de-skilled because of technology, but also the kind of behind the scenes sort of invisible work that exists to sort of support technology. So thinking of like content moderators on Facebook, or the fact that a lot of AI is driven by click workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk. So I think a lot of the sort of issues around low-wage work are kind of the same historical issues that have always existed with sort of pushes for better wages, better working conditions. I guess there are sort of ways in which regulation can help a lot of issues. Going back to the example of automated scheduling software and unstable scheduling, there's this practice called on-call scheduling, which is basically a lot of workers have to call in 2 hours in advance of their work shift to ask whether or not they actually have a shift, or whether they're needed. And this creates a lot of problems because basically in that 2-hour gap, you can't really do anything, you can't really make plans because you have to be sort of on call. And in California, there was a California Court of Appeals that issued a ruling that said, like, okay, so if you're making workers like being on call for like these 2 hours, then you should be paid for that work. So I think it really depends on the specific technology and what that technology does to the quality of work or experience of workers. So I think it really depends on I think it has to be very specific to the issue at stake.
And just speaking to the range of studies that are out there predicting what will happen with regard to automation, and in particular, the ones that cite specific numbers of jobs that might go away, there's huge variance. So depending on the economist, you get everything from literally the inverse. It could be we're going to end up with more high wage jobs, more low wage jobs, more high skilled jobs, more low skilled jobs, because we're just really, really bad at predicting what's going to happen with technology and the labor force. What everyone will agree on is that there will be change. So we don't know what the change is, but we know that the labor force will change and the demands on the labor force will change. So the way that I think about it is, how do we build flexibility in the workforce to be able to adapt to change? And that's where I was thinking about the lifelong learning stuff we talked about earlier. More questions?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my study is related to the last comment about the Amazon recruitment tool that was talked about. So in particular, what I'm wondering about are these new tools in machine learning, which rely on vast amounts of data. And so it is impossible to sort of see the algorithm and understand how it works. What that means is that it is sort of wholly determined by the data that it's fed, right? And so my question is, how do we avoid these algorithms being fed biased data that sort of has the prejudices of our current day built in? And is there any way to sort of make these new machine learning tools not inherently reactionary, and that they're built on sort of the current day and can't see into the future?
So I will say, in my experience, one, I'm not a black box coder, so that's not where this perspective is coming from. But I do think a lot about data bias, and that's one of the ways that the product development cycle can be altered so that, like, for example, this is just starting to change, but most people who come out of university with a computer science or engineering degree are not actually taught to question where their data comes from or whether there are biases in the data. So even just starting there, step one, that would be great. Then moving to technology companies, again, changing the design process so that there's a question. Where is this data coming from? What biases might it contain? How might we mitigate against that? Would be huge. So it's not going to solve the whole problem, but I think that would be a good step in the right direction. Does anyone else want to talk about data bias?
Yeah, yeah. I just want to jump into that. I've also seen that there's much more focus on ethics, on computer programs in university, that you have to learn about how your decisions are impacting people, how your technology is impacting people, what kind of bias. So, for example, if you're looking at people's bias, how is a software that is based on existing data going to produce a certain kind of results? And that's the same what we've seen in the media industry. If you look at what readers have read before, are you going to serve them more and more of that? Or are you going to design a system where you have more serendipity, more random results? So, and there's also lots of values in the choices you make. And I also want to pick up a point that Bruce mentioned. Do we have to take all this technology into use? I mean, even though we can automate maybe everything in society, do we want to do that? And what technology do we want to use in automatization? So I think that's a value choice as well.
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, how familiar have you found government people to be kind of up to date on what the different technologies actually do and how they'll affect the economy, and maybe how that even differs between the US and Norway?
I'm happy to say, so several jobs ago, I worked for a couple of members of Congress. Not the most tech-savvy group. Not breaking news here. So actually, New America has a program called Tech Congress, which is designed to bring technologists into congressional staffs for this very reason. The other, like the historical thing that I think about as being a game changer with regard to policymakers understanding or not understanding technology, is that funding for this centralized group of experts that used to exist in Congress that was nonpartisan went away in the 90s. And so there used to be a cadre of people who was just there to serve as a resource across issues that's no longer there. So individual staffs are now having to educate members of Congress. I now also work with city governments. Same deal. So unless you're working in the New Yorks and the San Franciscos and the LAs of the world, you're getting very, very few people who understand technology enough to be able to forecast in the way we're describing today. So huge problem. I think programs like Tech Congress are great and are absolutely helping, but we've got to think more deeply about how to get technologists into public sector jobs. Anybody else? Do you want to talk about, I have no idea in Norway.
Since I have one of the ministers here.
Yeah, anybody from Norway.
No, but I think in general, there's this cliche that politicians don't understand technology, but I think it's much more varied. What we see in the Norwegian parliament and among the ministers is that most of them have higher education. So most of them have fairly elite backgrounds. And of course, the knowledge of technology is varying. And but one more structural situation in Norway is that we haven't had a minister of digitalization. We have one now, which is interesting. But that has also probably made it harder to make more structural policy changes when it comes to technology, because all the ministries have some kind of responsibility for technology, but no one is taking the main responsibility. So I'm very excited to see what is going to happen with the new minister.
So can I ask, and it's okay if you don't know, but what does the Minister of Digitization do? Like, what are they responsible for?
Maybe three.
Because that could encompass a huge array of things or a very small slice, and I just don't know. The huge range, okay.
Yeah, he started 2 months ago.
Okay, 2 months,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
That is really interesting. Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can comment that I'm
Please.
also a Norwegian bureaucrat.
Perfect.
Yeah. So one of the main tasks of the Ministry of Digitalization is transforming public sector, because the public sectors, not only in Norway but also in the States and also in Europe, they are lacking behind compared to the private sector. So one of his tasks is to make sure that he is a key driver and a supporter for the change makers in the public sector, because they need a person like him or her to actually understand what the task is. I don't think we lack too many technologists in the public sector. We lack people who can translate from what is the value of what the technology brings to the table and all the issues around it, like Bente mentioned, all the ethical issues. We need transformers. We need who can, we don't need more tech people to explain things that doesn't have the wider perspective. So I think a combination of those together with the politicians, so a better common language. But my comment was actually to you, Bruce, because I think you have had a very interesting comment when you mentioned that all the things that we fought for 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we need to bring that up again, because automation is not new. It's the same response now as it was when we were looking in New York when they were trying to introduce motor cars instead of horses. It's the exact same reactions. But listening to stories from you on how you treat your employees, I get worried, really, really worried, because that way of treating employees, I mean, that would not be accepted in Norway. So my question is, what is the status of the labor unions in the US? And have they been a driving force in automation and the future? What are their role?
Who wants to tackle that one?
I'll say a little bit. I mean, part of what they're looking at is around this idea of continuous learning. So they're trying to implement into their programs to keep their workers current, coding, sometimes even computer basics. They're looking at creating computer technology centers. So, I mean, you just have it working in that regard. One thing that's interesting here in New York City is because we have such a major civic tech movement, that's sort of the driver for that. And a great deal of that is done out of civic tech. Silicon Harbor is a part of that. But there is someone, and it doesn't hurt to say, Andrew Roger, who's really been driving a lot of that, as well as our borough president, Gail Brewer. So they've really been driving this idea of civic tech and equity. And even Microsoft is involved in some respects through what John Paul Farmer is doing. But New York City is unique in that way, that we have this group of people, we all are friends, who are really pushing this. But increasingly, people are starting to understand its importance. They're not understanding it from sort of understanding the tech side of it, but they're understanding it in that it's affecting their workers, it's affecting the status that unions have vis-a-vis their ability to gain useful concessions out of companies. And what has put it in stark contrast is the fact that Amazon did move to New York. So folks have been lit up by that, and they're trying to figure that one out because, yeah, maybe they're sort of an evil corporation, but also 25,000 jobs were lost. It could have really helped the people of Queensbridge housing in Queens. So I think that's going to be a firebrand. It's going to start people really starting to think about this and get past this idea that the corporation is evil. Here's all the ways it's going to affect your life deleteriously, and try to figure out what it means to get some of these future companies, here. And Google doesn't care that Amazon ain't coming, and Facebook don't care, but we do, and it was important because there is no tech community in Queens. So I think what we're at is a cusp where people are starting to figure out, well, first they're getting started about this because they're pissed about it or they know something might affect them negatively. Now the conversation is starting to happen where we're starting to try to frame this discourse. And this is an important, I think, start around what really needs to happen.
And going back to thinking about the Minister of Digitalization, New York City actually, just to give you guys more props, has an interesting model for this in that they have, their city council created a committee to decide how automated decision systems should be used by the city. And what's interesting about that is, so there's a committee of elected people who are going to provide recommendations, and then there's an outside group of experts, including myself and lots of other fantastic people who are helping them think that through. So this is one model to get at your question. This is one model for in the interim before we have the right people in the public sector thinking about and working on these issues. It's one way we can bring some expertise from the outside in, at least to supplement. Okay, more questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the very interesting discussion. I'm a member of the Norwegian Parliament, and so I'm one of the people who tries to understand technology from a legislator.
You should have answered the question earlier.
Well, I wouldn't have a better answer, but my question goes back to this very topic. And as legislators, a lot of the debate is on how are we going to regulate technology to ensure that, for example, equality is included when you develop the new vital tech infrastructure. But as legislators, I think it's even harder than, for example, economists to try to figure out what the future will be like, especially when it comes to technology. So, is there anything in your perspective that legislators can do in order to promote equality, for example, in technology development, other than what's already been touched upon? Is there some blank spaces that we're missing currently that could be filled?
Does anyone want to start? I'm happy to as well. Okay, I'll go ahead and start. So I think about this in a couple ways. One is access to technology, and the other is readiness for technology. So thinking about access, a lot of the stuff that Bruce works on, how to make sure that everybody has equal access to current and new technologies, and there's lots of ways to do that. I don't know if you want to talk through some, but just thinking through that as technology is created, and some of that requires regulation, some of that requires working with technology companies, so there's an access question. And then there's a readiness question. And it sounds like you guys pretty much have this one covered, but there's probably more to do. As technology in particular changes jobs, how to make sure that workers who are displaced have the ability to upskill, to reskill, to change over time. And that's a really hard thing to do because we don't know exactly what workers might want. So like, for example, the trucker example is used all the time in the United States. Where I live in Arizona, there's now all these auto-driving trucks that don't have people in them because we test them. And we assume that truckers are gonna wanna maybe learn to code or maybe, I don't know, and maybe become a lawyer, I don't know. My point is, we don't actually know. And so this is the hard part of legislating around the unknown, right? Which I know you're nodding at me. So just, I think, providing the support, the resources, the flexibility, and the acknowledgement that everybody is going to have to adapt as technology changes jobs is hugely important. We have not gotten there in the United States, but maybe you guys can do it. Does anyone else want to speak to any of this?
I just wanted to add a pretty short comment to sort of listen to experts beyond just economists. So sociologists, anthropologists, people who spend, deep studying in the field, actually talking to the people who are most affected by technologies.
Yeah, and since I'm from the research side, I would say more research. But seriously, I'm not expecting politicians to predict the future, and I think many people need to be part of that conversation. And sometimes often the government is ordering large reports, and it takes 3, 4, 5 years before they're ready. It could also be possible to have more short-term reports. For example, like the EU, this high-level expert group, they published this report on artificial intelligence, and they did the same about fake news, and that is work that is done within 6 months. So that could be one way to get an updated view of what is happening within this new field what is the best solutions, and also, of course, cooperating with other countries, because this is not something Norway is dealing with alone.
One of the things that we do at Silicon Harlem is we work with our elected officials. We work with our borough president. We work with the mayor. We sit on his broadband task force and the various committees that are tied into that. We also work with our local community boards, and as well as our school boards. So we work with all the different bodies which have something to do with how it can affect people's lives. But the primary way in which we do what we do is we work with communities. We really engage the community in such a way so that they feel comfortable addressing these issues. So as I talked earlier about how we formed as a meetup, the first meetup was sort of a social meetup, and it was really cool. But ultimately it morphed into these sorts of meetups where we actually would bring in public officials and companies and people from the community and would have them come together. And what that did was it attracted more public officials who then said, oh, here's a place where I can come and learn about the technology in such a way that's comfortable for me. So I guess it all ties into sort of this idea of this sort of, making learning continuous, but also making it something that people feel comfortable doing, because most folks don't want to admit that they don't know about this tech stuff. So that level of comfort is very important. We call it not high tech, but high touch.
That's so exciting to hear that you're working with multi-disciplinary stakeholders in this problem. And I'm wondering, kind of going off of that, both from you, Bruce, and maybe Megan, working at New America, which deals with both like Google and the government, what conversations you guys are having that really bring people together that might have different interests, whether it's financial interests or public interests, and kind of the most promising topics that you found everyone can really have a space in.
I'll talk about a real project that we're involved with. New York City has been granted over the next 5 years as much as $50 million from the National Science Foundations for a project called Cosmos, which is some academic acronym. But what it's designed to do is to accelerate 5G technologies, but it's in Harlem. And so what we have are community boards, the Apollo, the schools, Silicon Harlem, but also Columbia University, Rutgers, NYU, the top wireless development organizations in this area, but they've all come together, and it has to focus on community. It can't just be technologies that get deployed downtown or around Columbia. It has to be in the community. And so, in answer to your question, we've had a community conversation that has started to resonate with people. It resonates with the researchers, it resonates with the data scientists, it resonates with the local public officials on the community board level. So that's been really exciting to see that happen over the last 6 months. This was 2 years in development, but as people have started to get into the community and feel comfortable in the community, here's the things that we're starting to see happen. And also, just alluding back to the event that I was telling you about last week, that was Women in Technology, they went and made sure they invited community board members, which hadn't been done in the past. So there's that type of friendliness that's starting to happen, which we think will bode well as we try to drive these technologies forward. And also the City of New York is involved in this. So it really is, as you said, it's multi-stakeholder, but we're listening increasingly to the community and starting to take a research methodology into consideration called participatory technology assessment. So all the heavy research is done in the community with the community members, including people who live in NYCHA housing, right? Infamous NYCHA housing, New York City Public Housing Authority. But everyone is starting to get involved.
Similarly, we have a project called Shift Labs, which is designed to do what I was describing earlier in terms of going to cities around the country and engaging people in, again, community-led conversation. So we have in each place we go, we have a really highly curated group of leaders who come together, everybody from university presidents to entrepreneurs to artists to, young people. And those we think are likely to be impacted by technology to surface One, we give them research so that they understand, hopefully, what's likely to happen with regard to automation in their region. And then two, ask them, what are your priorities? You've seen what's likely to happen. What do you think is most important? And then what comes out of that are a bunch of pilot programs that a lot of people are excited to try. So many of the things that I've mentioned, working with employers to do, micro-credentialing, which is basically the opposite of a university degree, but still in terms of length and breadth, but still provides you with something that will help you get a new job. Providing wraparound services to employees who might not be able to access training programs. Working with companies to bring different kinds of people into the company who wouldn't normally have access, all that kind of stuff. And we're purposely doing this in cities that are really different from each other. So everywhere from Phoenix to Indianapolis to Detroit, and we're about to do this in several rural areas as well. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. It's a very interesting conversation to follow. I have two questions, and actually a follow-up question from Anita. The first is, you tell some stories how workers are treated using new technology to treat them in a very bad way. But isn't it possible to say that the principle we have for treating workers in the business today should also be the same principles tomorrow? How can we transfer the principles that we and the support we have for workers in our law and system today into the new digital world? That's the first question. The second one, we all keep saying that we can't predict the future, but we know something about the history. We know how big changes through history has changed people. The only thing we know that these changes we are in right now is heavier and more rapid. They are going to change faster. So then when we look backwards through history, we see that to raise the knowledge among people, to raise the education among people, always been the solution to be able to follow up the big developments. So I think that education and knowledge is the right key also to be able to follow up the big challenges we have right now. You touched it with lifelong learning, but I think that we really need to do something in the bottom of our education system also to be able to follow the challenges we now meet. If one of you want to comment on that, it would be interesting.
Anybody want to start?
Okay. Yeah, I can start on the last one because that's more relevant for me. But when it comes to lifelong learning, I also think the system we have now is good, but it's not good enough for that kind of thinking, that kind of living, redoing your career. I think we need a different kind of way of teaching, and also how to fund that. Who's going to pay for that? Is that companies? Is that individuals? Is it government? Because today normally it is the companies or the individual who's paying for that. So one thing is how to finance lifelong learning. And also how to structure it. For example, today, in order to do re-education or further education, you have to do that while you're doing maybe a full-time job. That's really hard for so many people to do. And also how to make sure that that is something that not only the most resourceful people can do, which I think maybe that's a tendency today. So that requires a new way of thinking about education. I'm curious to see what you're going to do with that, Trine.
I'm also happy to note this is one time when the United States and Norway are relatively similar, I would say, and where we are on an issue, which is amazing. Anybody else want to address either the labor part of the question or the education part?
I'll tie the two together in some respects. I think one of the things that we should think about, and I talked about this at a few years ago at Columbia when we were working closely with IBM. IBM was looking to get Columbia engineers who had entrepreneurial skills, but they wanted more than that. And so what they wanted was sort of a value-driven individual. And so one of the things I spoke about is, we talk a lot about technology. It's the material thing. It's the computer. It's the television. It's the phone. But it's a made thing. And so the first part of technology is techne, and that's skills and know-how. So I think it's important for us to think about what that entails. There's an art to that, and there's a science to that. But also I think there's a humanistic value system that has to now inform everything that we're doing. And that's what we start to then draw upon. It will bring us together, and it will drive what we do as we try to develop technology. So I think what we have to do is change the conversation. And in some respects, I think we have to go back to certain ideas that get conveyed through literature. And really think about those things which teach us about how we value others, how we think about the world that we live in, how we start to change our behaviors is what we really want is a world where everyone treats one another well, and that is the kind of society that we're trying to build. So, a lot of what I've been wrestling with is, as I was sort of saying, where we're now having conversations with people who are very comfortable talking about data. They're comfortable talking about software-driven radios and telephotonics. But we're having them now have to talk about things in the community, things that people care about, things that normally don't find their way into what you normally think about when you think of technology. So I think that's how we can create really an inclusive umbrella that can bring us all together, because it's those, I think, deep human values that we need to kind of push to the fore at this particular point in time. And I think then we'll actually, we'll advance this. I think we need to look at, like, the civil rights movement, right? I mean, they walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and here were these nonviolent people, and they got beaten up by the cops. The second time they crossed that bridge, they had a truly diverse group of people walking across that bridge, and the cops didn't attack them at that point in time. You also had the federal government involved. But what I'm trying to say is what that value system, portends is something we've seen before. We've seen it on television. We've seen this type of civil rights movement, and we've got to figure out how we really bridge our differences, and I think we can then solve these problems.
And in terms of the education part of your question, one way I like to reframe this is we often ask young people today, what do you want to do when you grow up? The question I like to ask is, what problem do you want to solve? And that changes from, you're going to have a static job, you're going to be a firefighter or whatever, and instead gets kids thinking more like, okay, I'm gonna address a problem throughout the course of my life. How I do it, what job I have, that's probably going to change and isn't as important. Did you want to touch on anything? Okay. Great, last question.
No pressure. Yeah, so I'm an engineer, actually, and I think a lot about responsible development. But as an engineer operating in a for-profit company, ultimately, all incentive structures are based around creating business value. And so my question as I think about that is sort of realistically, do you think we can expect government regulation to catch up to sort of work against those incentive structures? If not, how do we start to create a culture where it is normal for tech companies to self-regulate? And even when it's not directly incentivized by, profit-making endeavors, which, of course, like most companies are strictly profit-making endeavors, especially in a primarily capitalist market. So how do we start to work against that? How do we start to create a culture of self-regulation if we're seeing technological advancements that government can't keep up with anymore?
What they did during the advent of the internet boom in the mid-90s, they figured out a light touch, right? Light regulation. They didn't want to basically impede the potential of growth for these companies, but they also informed the policies to make sure that there were issues of equity and opportunity built into the kind of regulations and laws that they put in place. And we saw the rapid growth both of both of .coms as well as .orgs. Where we are right now, where we're in late-stage capitalism, and where we have unfettered capitalism, which creates these kind of adverse social effects, there's some level of regulation which is going to have to be figured out. But what we have now is it's either all the way over here or it's all the way over here. We're going to have to figure out how to bring it somewhere closer to what makes sense, because this is unsustainable. It's having effects on the environment. It's having effects on those who are least fortunate. And it's having effects on where we potentially see this going. Now, also, what might have to happen is consumers might have to vote with their pocketbooks and not buy this stuff, right? But we have an interesting inflection point right now as we're moving into the next generation internet, which we haven't talked about at all. And that's informing everything we're doing. We're going to have smart cities, we're going to have Internet of Things, driverless cars, and it's all going to be driven by these advances in the next generation internet. And what's actually interesting about that is that internet is basically moving closer to the consumer, or else it won't work. And so I think that gives the consumer and communities a particular level of power. And ultimately, because these companies are driven by a for-profit motive and the bottom line, they're going to have to start to think about this, because you're going to basically be non-competitive if you're not thinking about what this means from the standpoint of the users. As we look at women, who basically, I believe, have at least half or more than half of the spending power in this country, I think it's important to aggregate and harness that power and start to make those demands. And I think you'll start to see changes. But this idea that companies are all powerful, or the folks in Silicon Valley are the smartest people in the universe, that's a real problem, that's a myth. And so we have to debunk that myth, and we have to basically re-empower people so that they understand what it means to use these technologies. And the fact that people are getting upset about data privacy and the use of their data, that's the starting point of that. We're going to have to harness that anger, but you know, that's where sort of enlightenment comes in, both on the community level and I think on the advanced policy level. And together we can start to make some inroads. But you know, I work for a for-profit company, right? We work to make a profit. But we also know that you can build things that help people and that can grow your market. The digital divide represents $1 billion underserved, untapped market. And anytime there's a market failure, that's supposedly where government is supposed to enter in and address those issues. And so what we have are market failures right now. It's just this thing where everybody thinks everybody's so smart working in these tech companies, and Silicon Valley knows everything, but that's starting to change. So I think the groundswell could start here, and then we could move this whole thing forward.
Yeah, just want to add from my perspective from the media industry, it has been self-regulated, at least in quite a few countries, for many, many years, in order to avoid the state governing it. So there's been a clear advantage to be self-regulated and to have, I would say, fairly strict ethical rules. And you also find the same within, you find it within research, for example. We have ethical rules we have to follow. We find it within medicine. So this is very common within different kind of areas of life. And I think that could be, maybe it's unavoidable that the big tech companies, they're going to be regulated anyway, and we're not sure, but to have some kind of rule lines, ethical rules. We've also seen discussions about ethics for algorithms, to propose that, to be proactive within some of these tech companies. I think that would be a great advantage.
Okay, well, with that, we will wrap it up. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a fantastic conversation.